Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Hello, and welcome to the first live recording of Shaken Not Burned, where we unpack the future of business, climate, and everything in between. Just a few years ago, corporate climate ambition was peaking. There were SBTi approvals everywhere, net zero pledges, ambitious sectoral roadmaps. But unfortunately, today the mood has shifted. While most companies haven't completely walked away from climate action, many of them have rethought their pledges. They've said that it's an ambition, it's an idea. Part of the problem is the difficulty in delivering credibly on a lot of the targets that have been set in place. So tonight, what we're here to talk about is decarbonisation dead? Or is it just due for a rethink? In 2024, with rising costs, political pushback, and a new debate around the difference and the use of carbon neutral and net zero, we're trying to understand, is carbon neutral a credible stepping stone towards net zero, or is it a dangerous distraction from the deeper transformation that we need? So helping us make sense of this today is Chris Hocknell, the director of 8Versa. 8Versa is a UK-based consultancy guiding businesses through the complex terrain of ESG, carbon strategy, and compliance, which is something we're going to be talking about a lot. With over 17 years of experience and a focus on measurable impact, he's helped a lot of companies move from box ticking to actual progress. And actually, one of the most interesting things is Natural Carbon Solutions, which is a certification which helps companies credibly tackle the hardest to abate emissions. Together, we're actually going to unpack the state of net zero, the rise of skepticism, and what a more pragmatic and credible climate strategy might look like in 2025 and beyond. So, Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So why are we asking if decarbonisation is dead? What's been happening in the last couple of years?
So if we go back to probably 2021 was probably the heyday of net zero. The SBTi came out with its corporate definition of net zero. So that's what the definition is for companies. Before that, it had been quite interpretive and people making up their own versions. That kind of clarified what it meant. And then we had this, I suppose, zeitgeist of big companies thinking, I need to get on board with this. And we had this flurry, about 12 to 18 months of just this flurry of the big corporates, the big names, any one sector saying, this is something we've got to have. It's the definition. It is the only metric in town of success when it comes to carbon. And then they all piled in, and then that creates this big ripple effect through the rest of the sectors where the second, the third, the fourth within that sector kind of jumped on the bandwagon as well. We would meet clients saying, this company's said they're going to be net zero, we're going to do it, and we're going to do it in 2040. And then we had this kind of ripple effect. So that was probably 2-3 years ago before the cracks started showing. And in the last 18 months, we've had approximately a few, maybe a bit more, several hundred companies that have explicitly had their targets taken off, their targets and their commitments removed from the SBTi, or have actually quietly.
So is that removed by the SBTi?
Yes, for not submitting their data. And obviously, many of these companies have huge sustainability teams. They have the data. They just haven't submitted it because they're not compliant and there's no point submitting it. And then, or they've kind of faded into the background and just, slightly just let it disappear and not say much about it.
So is this, because one of the criticisms has been this idea that targets are set and companies go, we're going to be net zero.
Yes.
We've got an SBTi target. And then you get to the end of it, don't get anywhere. And you've had 18 months of positive press saying, oh, this company's doing wonderful things around net zero, and then just vanishes. Mm-hmm. So, are we talking about this as a retreat, or is this just a recalibration of what it actually means to be able to meet a target?
I actually think it's a bit of both. I think there's clearly a lot of retreat, and that's amongst some of the biggest names. We actually have a paper coming out this month which looks at the various different sectors and some of the big names that have pulled out and why. And a lot of the big names have pulled out quite clearly and have chosen, I suppose, not to pursue this. And I think ultimately they've targeted quite ambitious scenarios for carbon reductions without really knowing incrementally how they're actually going to get there. And I think they've crunched the numbers. They've realised that they can do X, Y, Z to maybe shave off 5% here, 5% there. But realistically, they've been far too ambitious, and they've signed up in the heat of the moment without actually having a plan. Or in many respects, they've realised that it's actually going to be a potential threat to their fundamental business model or their bottom line. And then obviously it's been overruled.
Can you give me some kind of example of that? Because I think that's a really, really important issue.
Yeah.
That no company is going to try and do something that's going to put itself out of business.
Yeah.
So what sort of thing are you talking about?
I think the most stark example is probably coming from the tech sector. So, Microsoft is one, and many of the big tech companies had quite ambitious net zero goals, and they'd always, they'd tried to position themselves as being on the forefront, on the cusp, drivers of this agenda. And basically obviously, we've had GPT, AI, and this last few years has been nothing but wall-to-wall AI chatter. And depending on which estimates you look at, they could be projecting an increase of 5 times the amount of power that they will be consuming through dedicated data centers for compute, for AI algorithms, models, etc. So they've realised they can't increase energy consumption by 5 times, and they've just backed out.
Yeah, because that was actually one of the issues with the SBTi that I heard a lot, which is that if you were a growth company and you were looking to displace established high carbon businesses, you couldn't grow your emissions in order to displace something else, because to be on an SBTi target, you have to be lowering them constantly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is one of the biggest failings, and I think one of the biggest gripes and frustrations I have with the SBTi. And I don't want to be too disparaging, but
let's save that for the conversation about SBTi later on, because I think there's something really important here, and we probably need to go back to it, which is the world has changed so much in the last couple of years. You talk about AI, but we've actually got this situation where the current trade wars that are happening, that's having a fundamental impact on supply chains, on clean tech investment patterns. And although we're still seeing a lot of money in renewables, a lot of people are having to rethink it. So, we've got the DEI backlash, which has got the ESG backlash. We've got the politicization of climate. There are discussions in a lot of the major international agencies about reframing the way they talk about the challenge, because they're concerned that funding will be withdrawn if they use the words climate change. So if we've got this increasing fragmentation of trade, the international trade situation, we've got tariffs, we've got a cost of living crisis, we've got inflation, we've got recession fears.
Yeah.
How is this impacting what's going on with sustainability and action on sustainability overall?
I think enormously. The supply chains of a lot of the companies which we know are just unbelievably complex. And we look at something like consumer goods, and consumer goods providers will have tens of thousands of suppliers. And then, electronics, smartphones, for example, if I remember correctly, I think, is it 13,000 individual points within a supply chain to generate an iPhone, for example. So how on earth, when that's, tariffs are going up, down, and the supply chains it has an organic nature in it anyway, as companies move in and out, and contracts are won and that kind of thing. If we do supplier engagement, which is what we call it when we engage with a range of key suppliers for an organization, that's not static, and we're often told by the organization themselves, when we come back in 12 months, some of these won't be here. It's quite possible. So, and then if you're investing time in a supplier, like, let's work together, let's get our act together, let's see how you can decarbonize. And obviously we have to count that on our carbon balance sheet. They disappear, or they go, or we find a better one, or someone comes in cheaper. So there's a lot of potential for wasted resources, energy, and time, and that's in a relatively static environment, and where we have all this chaos in tariffs. I think it's probably an existential threat to supply chain decarbonisation, unless you probably reorient, I think, how you would see your supply chain and start moving things a lot more localized and in regulatory zones. But as we know, that comes with all manner of problems and doesn't happen overnight.
No, I mean, there's an interesting argument there for the reshoring that is driving a lot of the tariff discussion. You know, there's an argument to say that perhaps that could lead to increased decarbonisation, because if everyone actually reshores their manufacturing, you can manage something in a much more circular way.
Yeah.
Can't imagine that's going to happen overnight, but there's an interesting potential there.
Yeah.
But I think the point that you made, what it makes me think about is price. Because in the end, at the moment, decarbonisation costs money.
Yeah.
If we are in an inflationary period and a cost of living crisis and, you know, recession, most people are looking to get things as cheaply as possible.
Yeah.
Do you think that economic conditions at the moment are such that there is no room for net zero?
Not for the majority of companies. Minority maybe could, but I'm with the way the landscape is now. I think it's, as it's defined, net zero, I don't think it's possible. I mean, a lot of consumer good companies might be working with margins of 3 to 5%, and if we're looking at big supply chain in some of the hard to abate sectors, big supply chain changes or substitutions of materials or different processes and different ways of making products, you know, you're easily talking 25, 30% increase in manufacturing production cost. If your margin's 3 to 5%,
you're out of business.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. So that brings me to the thought that because decarbonisation is not going to stop, there may be a lot of pushback on ESG, but in the end, this is a question about managing risk. And in the last couple of years, we have seen growth in attribution of action and risk. We have seen greater traceability. We have seen greater accountability. The science has got clearer in how you connect these things. These risks are not going away, which means decarbonisation is not going away. But is it the term that's the problem? Is it the term net zero? Okay, talk me through that.
Yeah, so I think that the term net zero and the way it's formulated and the methodology that underpins it is a big part of the problem. And, you know, in my more reactionary moments, I'm tempted to say that the entire architecture of net zero should be demolished and deconstructed, or at least adapted to recognize some of the things that we're talking about. I just think a lot more constructive way to look at it is through risk and kind of modality, and how do we inject resilience and reduce risks to certain threats, rather than we've got this arbitrary deadline, we must reduce at 4.2% per annum, like on a spreadsheet, and that's where we're going until 2045. You know, and that's not the way things work. Nothing works like that, and certainly supply chains of big companies certainly don't work like that. So, with our entire kind of framework for reference, it's prioritized theoretical and methodological purity over real life application, and that is really dysfunctional. So, yeah, I think as you nailed it, really is how we look at it from a risk perspective, and that is usually the best way to look at it. And obviously, we have multiple competing risks, and companies are used to dealing with risk. Insurance deals with risk. Companies deal with risk all the time: supply chain risk, economic risk, regulatory risk. That's the language they speak. And you know, if using a risk model and a risk approach to look at climate and deal with climate solutions, I think it's much more constructive. It's more in the wheelhouse of organizations, and it's actually, I think, more productive and effective. I think a lot of the work from, say, Nassim Taleb on risk and how he sees risk as a kind of statistical mathematician type person is incredibly useful. And I think you could take a lot of leaves out of his book, and particularly how he looks at things like long tail risk. Like, for example, when he talks about climate change, which isn't that often, but his perspective on it, as far as I can gather, is that just looking at the average and the mean is a very, the average trending to 2.5 degrees. Okay, fine. But in reality, you're looking at outlier risk, and what happens if, say, I don't know, the Gulf Stream is interrupted. What does that mean for the UK? So, you don't live in an average. You live in kind of stochastic dynamics where something can happen. You find yourself in a different paradigm, and, you move into different states. So averages and trend lines and stuff is not very it's spreadsheets, it's abstract. And that's that's my disparaging part of the SBTi and the net zero is it's living in a spreadsheet and, looking at risk attribution, risk analysis, how we treat different risks and finding solutions to address risks is a much more, and being slightly more agnostic about the date that you might hit a net zero target or the means, is a much better way to solve the problem rather than having this fundamental target, which is very crude and rudimentary, and then just we're going to go there regardless of what it means.
Now, what's interesting about that to me is it almost feels like it's a communications problem, because what you have is scientists and engineers who work in a certain way. You have this methodological clarity, which must be correct. It must be robust. It must be robust.
Yeah.
It's got to be testable. You've got to be able to kick the tires and make it work. But at the same time, as you say, that's not how the real world works. Even if we're not using words like paradigmatic shift, we're still talking about the difference between acute risk, which is something immediate that happens, it's a flood, and maybe with the 1 in 100 year floods are now happening once every year. Mm-hmm. That's really problem. But there's this chronic risk as well, which is this shift into a completely different environment. Yeah. And I think finding the language that can speak to business that makes sense on a scientific basis is part of the part that we're lacking almost. And I think one of the things I think would be really useful to discuss, you mentioned your white paper about companies talking about why they've pulled back. Why have they pulled back? What are the reasons companies have stepped away from this? Because it can't just be, it's just because the target set and understood as the gold standard at the moment is too rigid. Mm-hmm. So what other reasons are they given?
Yeah, I think that some of the more successful ones who may have claimed reductions relatively soon have maybe picked some of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and the easy wins, and then they've obviously been faced with, usually when you look at your carbon abatement cost curve, it starts at, relatively low, might break even in 5 years' time, or it might just be a marginal cost, and it's kind of tolerable. And then very quickly, when you get past, 15, 20, 25% reductions across an organization, the line tends to invert in terms of the cost. And I think that's what scares companies. And I think, and you start talking about things that are much more structural. And I think a lot of companies have kind of hit that curve, or they've finally been forced to crunch the numbers, and they've thought, we're not going to take that risk. I also wonder if some of the way that it's been formulated and the lack of detail and kind of real successful approach to I suppose decarbonisation, net zero, has led to kind of insufficient approaches. So, I mean, there's a classic example of, say, Patagonia, or maybe let's say Ørsted, the energy companies. Ørsted they were an energy company, used to do fossil fuels, and they basically made this, I think it was around 2006, they basically said, right, we're getting out of this, renewables the future, and they're basically one of the biggest, wind and turbine manufacturers and installers in the world. So they've obviously said we need to reinvent this business model, and they've done it. Patagonia is one, and they're a niche product. So, their product's quite expensive, not for mass market, but they've said this is at the core of our values. This is the company we want to be, and they've basically pivoted that model, and they're on that path, and these companies will be net zero, I think, and they've reoriented their business model. But those who have kind of, I think, seen it as a marketing exercise, and they haven't looked at how do we structurally reinvent what we are as a business, which I know is probably, is a pretty shocking thing. I probably have to say in a board meeting, right? How are we going to redesign our entire business model that pays us dividends every year? And, you're probably not going to be the most liked person in that board meeting, but that's probably reality of what we're talking about. And I suspect that because of the function, the way it's been approached, those solutions haven't been arrived at, or it hasn't been looked at that lens. And then when things start getting a lot harder, it's just, we're out. And I wonder if some of the things you mentioned, particularly in the US right now, but with the more companies disappear and pull back, and obviously you have the enormous headwinds from the US administration, it's much easier now, isn't it, just to go, right, this is our jumping off time.
So this is actually what I wanted to ask you about. How are companies justifying this action? Because if they push so hard on being sustainable and believing that climate change is an issue, and we've got to protect our workers and our stakeholders and our company and our country, how do they justify going, oops, we didn't mean it?
Some have said we were 2030, which was ridiculously ambitious, but now we're going to do it in 2040 or 2050. So they pushed the date back and said, but don't worry, we're still doing it. We're just doing it later. And then I suppose others have said we can't get the data. It's not our fault. Our supply chain's too diffuse and that kind of thing. And I think there's a high percentage of companies that have who've answered in surveys, things like that, and said that they can't get the data, they can't crunch the numbers properly, and they can't determine what their real footprint is or where they're going. So we're basically out.
I thought AI was supposed to solve all of that. Yeah, I'm sorry, that wasn't fair. No, that's fair.
Yeah. I think this is probably I think it's quite an important point around the carbon debate, the carbon accountancy, as it's called, which unfortunately, when you say carbon accountancy, everyone starts to fall asleep.
Not two of people's most favourite words.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think that's one of the challenges we have. But what's fundamentally at the heart of carbon accountancy is carbon factors, and carbon factors is for a kilogram of paper, for a ton of steel, for a meter cubed of this liquid or chemical. There's an associated carbon value. Now they're created from what they call input-output models. So you can't afford to obviously look at every single component that goes into making that particular volume or weight of item. So you got to use macro data. So it's, we've sold $4 million worth of this product. If we look at that whole supply chain, what do we think the corresponding carbon was? Okay, it was this. And these get worked on, they get put into databases that you can buy, and that's what we use for our carbon accountancy. In those models, there could be 25, even 50% uncertainty. So we might say it's 200 kilograms for this.
50% uncertainty?
Yeah. So we might say it's 200 kilograms, but it could be 100, it could be 300. So, you're off by, and this is part of the problem because it's almost like a bit of a fakery or blag in terms of how accurate carbon accountancy is, because we're working with quite inferior data. And this is also a problem with the idea of net zero and SBTi. The idea that you can measure your carbon reduction to a decimal place every year is a nonsense when you've got 25-30% uncertainty as standard. Novo Nordisk is a good example. I think last year they recalculated their carbon footprint using better data, and they kind of worked very hard, and well done to them, worked very hard to improve their data, and their footprint halved. And it halved by, I think it was, I want to say it's roughly 2 million tons, but it's basically the entire footprint of Rwanda. So,
That's incredible. Why doesn't everyone do that then? Is it very expensive and very complicated?
I think you've got to invest a lot of time. And I think, I think when we have this conversation about data quality, and the data quality is probably another word that makes everyone go to sleep in the room, right? Okay, we need to work on data quality. Oh, God. So, that means speaking to suppliers, getting, not how much did you spend? And also, when we're using spend-based data, which is the standard way we do carbon accountancy, we spent £4,000 with you and you're a paper provider. That equates to this much in terms of carbon. But obviously with inflation, the kind of economic road we've been on for the last few years, that adds a whole lot of noise into that data. So what you need to do is obviously go to the supplier and say, okay, I know we spent £4,000 with you, but how many kilograms have you delivered to our office? And then they've got to go away and go, oh God, right, okay, here we are. And then you've got to do that wherever you supply, and you get physical data as opposed to financial. And then once you start working with that, then you can start moving places and start kind of taking out some of the noise in the data. But for someone like Novo Nordisk to do that is enormous. They would have had a big team or probably paid some very expensive consultants to go through it. But the reality is it's not actually a saving, right? It's just,
it's just
there's that much
change of knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But, and they're kudos to them. They admit it. They say this is a result of doing the carbon footprint better. But I think the fundamental problem is that we want to believe that everything's perfectly, quantifiable and very exact, but it's a very inexact science. Yeah. And a lot of the companies that have dropped out of SBTi I've quoted, it is impossible for us to get an accurate measure on our supply chain. Yeah. So, well,
I could bring us to a part of the conversation where we have a conversation about sustainability reporting and why it's so important that you have the cascade effect throughout the supply chain, so that there is a demand for this kind of information, so that you get accurate information, but maybe not tonight. Okay. But what I do think we should talk about is, if there is this complexity, this lack of clarity and accuracy in the data, what can we do differently? And I suppose this brings us to the conversation about the use of the term carbon neutral. Mm-hmm. So, what is it? How does it differ from net zero and the SBTi? And why should we be using it?
Carbon neutral was actually the first term. It was made by the British Standards Institute, which is a very, very, very good body in terms of standards, and they make standards that have been replicated all around the world. That was 2010. And the London Olympics actually in 2012 used the carbon neutral standard and did a lot of work on that, which is quite good. I've read the carbon reduction plan of 2012. It's pretty good. But the problem was it was the first standard. And inherently, when you tell someone to do something for the first time, you've got a lot of friction. So it built in a lot of flexibility. And it basically had things like measure as much as you can, but if you can't measure it, then don't. So, and obviously that inherent flexibility led organizations or products, whatever it might be, to basically go, that looks a bit hard. We'll measure that. And then we also had the rise of certain companies and certification schemes that were very willing to do 2/3 of a job, third of a job, in terms of their footprinting, and then obviously charge the same fee. And that actually is what undermined the definition carbon neutral, and that was quite a problem. And then that's why then net zero came out in 2021, 11 years later, and then there has been legal cases against carbon neutral. Danone is going through the New York courts, being sued by some activists because they're claiming, actually correctly, technically, that their Evian water is carbon neutral, but it actually is technically, but they say it's misleading, it's false advertising. So all this kind of stuff happened. And then what actually happened was in 2023, the International Standards Organization, not British, international, so now it's global, redefined carbon neutral and actually brought it much closer to the idea of net zero, which is you got to measure your scope 1, 2, 3. So that's the entire direct, indirect scope 3 being your supply chain. You've got to measure your entire supply chain, which was often what was locked off in the old definition of carbon neutral. And then you've also got to adopt a science-based reduction pathway long term, which before you didn't have to have that. We're going down by 80, 90% for whatever it is for your sector. You could just kind of chip away at 0.1% a year. So they've kind of built that in. So they've basically tried to readdress that. What they don't have, which is, I think, a good thing, they don't have, you must achieve 4.2% per annum, which is, again, ridiculous when you've got uncertainty of 25% in your measurement. So it tells you where you're going. It's a bit more, I think the best way to look at this and, well, how we communicate this is you need kind of, you need a North Star, a compass, not a map. We're not going to go down this street and then we take a left there and get that. That doesn't happen, obviously, but we need to know we're going here. So we need a science-based reduction target trajectory. We're going here, but then how we're going to go there is going to be, it's going to be up, it's going to be down. We'll have some successes. Yeah, and that's inevitable. So carbon neutral gives you that flexibility. But then the key difference is, which I think is a good thing right now, and obviously carbon credits get a bad rap, and that's not unfair in some instances. Whatever your remaining carbon is, and then we shouldn't say residual because residual can make it sound like it's 10%. It could be you make a 10% reduction. That would be a good win. It's probably more like you'll make a 3-4% reduction, and then that residual 96%, for example, you can go and offset through buying carbon credits. Net zero doesn't allow the offsetting. But what it does mean is obviously you don't get the benefit of offsetting until the very end. Yeah.
So with net zero, they do allow offsetting, but it's 5 to 10% max.
10% at the end, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But they've just obviously changed, which you probably all are aware of. They changed the guidance of Scope 3 because they were getting a lot of pushback and lobbying from the big companies saying there's no way we can achieve this.
To be fair, I think not everybody will know.
Right.
Basically,
okay.
big scandal.
Yeah.
Body turned around and said, no, it's fine. We're not limiting it to 10% only. But I think at the time they didn't tell their own staff.
Yeah, there was a big internal feud, and it went on for about a year. But they've released a consultation document, which is where they will allow a higher amount, but they haven't put a number on it, which is, I don't know why exactly, but they're going to allow more offsetting in that Scope 3 piece, but it hasn't been confirmed what it's going to be. So we'll see. But yeah, that's how they've kind of, so it's funny, carbon neutral has taken a big step towards net zero, and net zero under pressure has kind of backed off, and they're kind of getting closer
together. Okay.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing here is this ongoing battle, which happens in lots of different industries and sectors, this battle between flexibility and accuracy.
Yeah.
But I suppose why carbon neutral now? Because we'll get to offsets in a minute. But what is it about carbon neutral that makes it an appropriate tool for decarbonisation today?
Yeah. I think it has the inherent flexibility. So you're not bound by a minimum target, a minimum amount each year that you must hit on pain of death. You've got to have a carbon reduction plan, which you've got to if you're doing net zero anyway. So you've kind of, and you've got the end point, which is a science-based reduction target, which is, approximately 90%, depending on the sector. And so you've got your end point, and you've got the driver, which is you've got to do a carbon reduction plan. They've also increased the verification, so you've got to get it verified, which was the big problem before. It was a lot of companies, and an Apple one, when he did the Apple Watch and they claim it's carbon neutral, and as far as I can tell, they did not follow any rules or definitions for the carbon neutral. They just said it was. So they just they did
not
that.
going to build confidence.
Really, no, exactly. Yeah. So the new standard has been upgraded in that respect. So it is verification. So a third party looks at your numbers, marks your homework for you, has the end point, and then it has the actual reduction pathway. So I think that's adequately ambitious as far as I'm concerned, at least. I think that's more than adequately ambitious. And hopefully, if it inspires organizations to sponsor nature-based offsetting, kind of conservation schemes in places that are in desperate need of it, doing efforts to stop deforestation, putting money into that, as a result of the offsetting component, I think that's an upgrade to the idea of the net zero.
So let's talk about offsets, because obviously, the idea of scalable impact is really, really important. But one of the challenges that you have with the offset market is, the scandals, the misinformation, the discussion around offsetting, how it works, what the standards are, what you can rely on. And there are very different opinions in different parts of the market about how credible it is or how credible it could become, as well as what we mean by credible. And one of the things that I was interested in you mentioning is nature-based solutions, because of the fact that we talk about climate change all the time. And when we talk about decarbonisation, the focus is very much on climate and GHGs in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
But the reality is, functionally, we don't exist except within nature. If we don't have protection of nature, not only is it a massive risk, with I think it's over 50% of all globally listed companies are reliant or highly dependent on nature, how are we going to do it? So how do we make the offset market credible?
So I think the scandal that occurred a couple of years ago now, and that was particularly in the RED Plus methodology, and that was what we call avoidance credits, where we measure a baseline. So, for example, this area of forest is experiencing annual deforestation at 1% per year. We're going to make an intervention through enforcement, fences, park rangers, whatever it might be. We're going to make an intervention, and we're going to cut that deforestation rate down from 1% to 0.5%. Then we pocket the 0.5% difference. We intervene, we stop that, and then that's a credit, and then we can go and sell that. The problem is that whole premise is based on a hypothetical scenario, isn't it? If we hadn't made that intervention, what would have happened? Yeah. And, again, I'm talking about complexity of real life and that kind of stuff. So what naturally happened was you had every incentive to make the projections of what would have happened the most scary and horrendous as possible. And then your intervention obviously saved it. And it's all against hypothetical scenarios. And then that's what led to enormous overcrediting. And then when you actually went there, you found that maybe the interventions weren't effective, or what would have happened, what might have happened anyway. So that's what really undermined that particular methodology. Now, Vera, who were the body who actually issued that standard, they've released an updated version, literally, I think in March. So they're trying to address that, and they're trying to address the fact you need to do real measurements now. You're not modelling hypotheticals, which can be open to exploitation. So I think there is a bit of a self-correcting mechanism that, for example, those credits are now almost worthless. They're worth $2-3, something like that. Anything under the old methodology, whereas they may have been trading for 5 times that before. So that walking away from companies, and we've spoken to companies about this, and they've said we won't touch that because it's too much of a risk for us in terms of reputational risk if we're associated with a phantom project. So that's kind of self-corrected itself to kind of meet the demand make the credits actually worth something. At COP last year, there was, in theory, an agreement on the quality standard and framework for carbon credits. And the UK government, to be fair, has really worked on that.
That's for the international transfers or for the voluntary carbon market?
Voluntary carbon market, yeah. And there's been quite a lot of work that I only found out that recently, actually, but the UK had its delegation working on that behind the scenes. You really want to publish this stuff a bit more because there's actually some good work going on there. I don't know why they talk about it, but there we go. So there's actually been some successes there. But I think what you need is, at the moment, you have lots of different standards doing their own things, and they set the rules. I think if we had a bit of a quality standard, which was just mandatory around crediting, calculations, models, the more models you remove, the better, that kind of thing. Real empirical measurements, set some quality standards, and that's just that's yes or no. And then that's the basic approach to carbon credits. That will do a lot to lift like the tide of the credits. And it's like, if you haven't met if it will be the UN quality standard on voluntary carbon credits, then we're not interested.
So would that be the advice you would give to a company that was looking to offset, that it's got to be accredited by this? Because there are lots of different types of credit out there and lots of different types of businesses, and there may be some elements which are more appropriate for different sectors.
Yeah.
What would you say to a company looking to buy offsets? What makes it a good credit?
Yeah. So I think you got to pick a methodology that doesn't fall into the trap of the Red Plus, old Red Plus version. And it's got to be people like planting trees, for example, because in theory you could go there and you can see a tree and think, great, that definitely happened. So it's what we call additionality. It was additional to me putting my money in. So I think projects that have a very, indisputable additionality are very important. Nature-based tends to be preferred because it sounds nice, obviously, but it's got other associated benefits like biodiversity and things like that. But I think you want to hedge. If you're going to do something good, you can't rely on carbon. And one of the problems around decarbonisation net zero is it's a unidimensional metric, which is really, really annoying, because there's many instances where you could be doing things which might not look much on the carbon balance sheet or may look really good, but actually have big impacts on water, biodiversity, and things like that.
I saw a really interesting thing, which was a program to teach farmers in India how to do more regenerative agriculture.
Yeah.
And it saw an increase of 3 or 4% of organic matter in the soil, which fundamentally transforms its ability to hold water, grow food. That's transformation. Yeah.
And that's the sort of stuff which is brilliant. And that's the sort of stuff we should be looking at. And there's what we call them core benefits, but you get carbon in the soil. The farmer has a much more resilient land, much better income, their lives get better, economic development. It's one of those things. It's just like a triple win. So we want to look for those kind of things. Planting trees in a row, which is a bit out of date now. And I think a lot of companies have wised up to it, particularly to have an internal sustainability specialist. They know some of these pitfalls. But yeah, those projects, those credits with the core benefits, the biodiversity, the air quality, the agriculture, the economic benefits, the people that are working in and around the jobs. All that costs more. It makes the credit cost more. So we just need to get that. I suppose
that's where the challenge lies.
Yeah, that will increase the cost of a credit by 2-3 times. So really, when you're selling credits, you're looking at $30, $40, $50 per ton. But that's still below the social value of carbon, which is the estimated what it should be, the price of carbon, which, depending on who you speak to, is between $100 and $200.
Yeah.
So it's still a very cost-effective means.
I think the US put it up to $198 last year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Interesting timing. So I think what we're really talking about today is the fact that, we're quite clear decarbonisation is not dead. We just need to look at it through a different lens and a much more multi-sectoral, multi-solution, co-benefit kind of a lens. But I think one of the things I want to ask you is, what haven't I asked you about that you think I should have done?
Question. Where to start? I was worried you were going to ask me about the hard to abate sectors because they're a nightmare. Yeah, that would be brutal.
But I do think, though, the hard to abate sectors is it's a real challenge for the very simple reason that people go, oh, it's hard to abate.
Yeah.
And then they stop talking about it. And actually, one of the things we need to come to terms with is there are really hard conversations to be had. There are practical realities in life, in business, in industry that we have to find a way to solve.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me about how you solve that.
Yeah. So we could take something like cement and concrete, which is a nightmare. So 60% of the emissions for cement production are actually in the process, the chemical process, calcium chemistry. Calcium carbonate, then we split that, we get quicklime, and then as a process of that, you get CO2 released. And then, so we only have, we got all our energy going in, so in the kilns and everything like to produce the cement, but then 60% is actually in the chemical process producing the product itself. So no matter what we do, renewables, all that kind of stuff, what do you do about that? Concrete is obviously a remarkable material, and it's the entire basis of the urbanized world that we have. And there's There's very, very few products that have the properties of it. So it's just a world without concrete, which again, that sounds like another boring phrase, doesn't it? But a world without concrete is actually quite tough. So things like that are actually really, really quite challenging. And then if you look at, say, alternative processes, which some of the big companies are investing a lot of time and money in, but it's like 20, 30, 40, 50% on the cost of production. But that's one of the ones which, I suppose, as we touched on before, it's a fundamental rethink of the model. It's not, and the product itself needs to be thought again from the ground up. And obviously they're pretty tough conversations to have. But I think that ties into some of the wider things which we probably haven't talked about enough, which is one of the kind of things which is incredibly irritating in this and frustrating and watching, hoping for better action and better, more intelligent approaches to this, is that the input and the actions around research and development and new products innovation is a fraction of what it needs to be. There's not enough capital going into it by a factor of 3 or maybe 5, so for a start, and then the actions themselves aren't taking place. And I think that's where banks need to get better at that. You can't rely on the venture capitalists and the Californian billionaires to do that. Yeah, it's got to be commercial. And then I think this is where the governments are also massively falling down. You get into the issue about picking winners and that kind of thing, but I mean, rough rules of thumb, the R&D is probably a tenth of what it needs to be. Yeah. Like the IEA have done estimates on this, so International Energy Agency, they've estimated that around 50% of the technologies, looking at the endpoint, net zero endpoint, about 50%. We're lacking about 50% of the technologies we need to get to net zero from a global energy system perspective. So that's a very obvious thing. If you don't have half of the solution, maybe we need. So we need this kind of like COVID level response to R&D, and it can't just be something that happens on the periphery. It needs to be a wholesale rethinking, and that's what kind of it is most irritating when we have these narratives around, say, renewables are brilliant, there's not a problem, they're really cheap, we've got everything we need, and the hard to abate sectors are kind of ignored. And I think we need to recognise that there's the mother of all R&D projects needs to be undertaken for the next 10, 20 years, and it needs some enormous amount of funding. And it just seems to be absent from the conversation, because we will not get anywhere near our target without this enormous programme of R&D.
Yeah, and I think actually that brings us all the way back to this idea of risk and to involve the banks, because the likelihood of problems related to deforestation or climate change or water access, they're going to have direct impact on credit defaults. They're going to have a direct impact on GDP, on productivity, all these different levels, and that's going to affect the financial system, and that is going to drive change. But I think what also is interesting is I heard a phrase back in the day. I mentioned earlier the difference between acute and chronic risks and the difference between COVID and climate change. And the thing about climate change is for decades, people have thought it's something that happens to other people far away. But when COVID hit, it happened to people who were standing next to you. And it was in the moment and it was immediate. And until we have a recognition that we're already in that, most people haven't noticed yet. We're probably not going to move as far along as we have. But I think for me, it's been fascinating to listen to you talk about this, because it is the need for pragmatism that's going to actually make the conversations that need to happen.
Yeah.
So, Chris, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk to you today. I hope that you've all enjoyed it. Now, in our first live recording for Shake and Not Burn, we actually have some people in the room. So I would like to throw the floor open to questions, if anyone has any questions for Chris.
Firstly, big thanks as well.
This is where I have to put my glasses on so I can see who's got a question.
Yeah, if you were a carbon accountant for a fossil fuel company and you wanted to make your carbon accounts look as good as possible, how would you go about doing that?
If anyone's listening, it'll be about 500k a year for this kind of wizardry. I won't name the company, but I think what's already going on, and I think you could do this very effectively if you knew the levers to pull. You can exploit that uncertainty that we were talking about before. And for example, there's, if you're a bit of a geek and you know some of the numbers behind it, you probably find out which carbon factors are more more noisy and which ones go in your favor versus don't. So they're kind of assigning carbon factors and assumptions. You can manipulate your models a little bit to bring your footprint down. But the biggest thing, the first thing that I would do if I was very highly paid by an oil company would be to do what we call scope switching. So we mentioned before the scopes 1, scope 2, scope 3, and scope 1 and 2 is direct and indirect. So if you're burning gas of the oil refineries, enormous amounts of fuel burned on site, doing all the processing and that. Indirect is electricity, what you buy. So obviously enormous energy consumers, and that's big scope 1 emissions. You own them, so they need to sit in scope 1 and 2. Now, what I would do, theoretically, we shouldn't be telling the oil companies how to do this, should we? They probably know. Maybe they're already doing it. So what you would do is you would basically sell off a refinery, or you would get someone else to buy it and then take a stake in that company, a controlling stake, say 51%, whatever it might be. And then it moves from scope 1 and 2 into your purchased services because it's someone else and you're purchasing the service, but you have a controlling stake and it sits somewhere else in your balance sheet. And the chances are you will get a better carbon factor, and it's noisy, so it's harder to measure. And there's a bit of a philosophy which is correct to some extent, but it ignores this, which is focus on scope 1 and 2 first, and then, scope 3 if you can, makes sense. But in reality, what you do is you just push as much as you can into scope 3, and then you go, we've made an 18%, 40% reduction on scope 1 and 2, aren't we brilliant? But you're actually just switching it into different categories and also hiding behind the data noise. So yeah, that would be the way to game the system.
I mean, I personally wouldn't suggest that any investigative journalists who want to look at the public data on fossil fuel companies might be interested in that. I've no idea. Any other questions?
I want to ask about regulation, because there's been quite a lot of sustainability regulation sort of coming in almost at the same time as this rollback has been happening.
Yeah.
What effect do you think that's having? So like EU, UK, like other parts of the world, sort of starting to look at carbon border.
Yeah.
Like, how is that playing into this dynamic that you've been talking about?
I think some of it's needed. So, for example, if you take the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, as it's called, basically what that is trying to do is that naturally we import so much stuff from Asia because it's really cheap, and the whole raft of labour issues and things like that. And to be honest, they actually do many things in manufacturing better. To be quite give them their due on that. We import a lot of high carbon goods, and in reality, which is another thing to look at, in the UK, the government uses this strapline of we've halved our emissions since 1990. Technically, that's bollocks, to use the appropriate terminology.
Just sent it elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, depending on how you look at it, about half of that reduction is pure deindustrialization, pure absolutely zero benefit whatsoever. And then the other half is I reckon half of the other half, so 25% is roughly speaking, is probably embedded things. So, for example, China's grid is getting more lower carbon as it's installing solar at a phenomenal rate, that kind of thing. So, some of its embodied emissions are coming down, for example, and generally there are some moves in the right direction. So the UK's kind of banking that carbon reduction, but it's actually not real carbon reduction as such. And the CBAM mechanism is trying to address that. So you've got steel made in Germany versus steel made in China, and the carbon difference is whatever they determine it to be, and then they put a carbon price on a differential to make sure that cheap, higher carbon imports aren't preferred. The problem with that is it's very, very, very hard to accurately determine the carbon difference, and it's actually labyrinthian in its kind of nature. And if we do a life cycle assessment for one product, so someone came to us and said, what's the embodied carbon of that laptop? It would be 3, 4, 5 months work for a team to kind of actually to get it down to like grams. So the idea you're going to do that for the world's products is a bit much. So I think this is what the EU is really good at. Actually, technically, EU regulation is actually incredibly well designed, and people that design it are incredibly talented and very intelligent people. But it always seems to, in a lot of senses, fall down on the implementation phase. It gets very hard and very complex very quickly. So CBAM's going to have to happen. I don't know how they're going to do it. They might have to just do it rough and ready and just make some kind of concessions on accuracy and just try and deal with it that way. But I think the big problem is you got this bifurcation. The US is actively going in the opposite direction. It's reinforcing Mark Blythe, the economist, who I would recommend look on this. He's about to bring out a book, I think, on carbon and the carbon economics. He's an economist by background. And what he calls the Carbon Coalition, who are actively embedding the carbon economy into the US economy, putting hurdles in front of renewable power and all these kind of actions, which are actually making it regulatory much harder from a regulatory perspective to actually implement renewable solutions. So you've got the US going off in that direction. Whether it ends up stranded is another question, but for the time being, it's cheaper to consume energy by a factor of 2.5 in the US. China, it's 4 or 6. So I think it's an existential threat if you are doing this unilaterally without, and then whether it's CBAM or something else, it's a massive challenge. And I think that ultimately that's obviously at the bottom of the net zero backlash, a lot of the cost of living stuff, which we do have to own up to. And a lot of costs are green taxes. And a lot of the way we're implementing things is actually increasing the cost here, and where we don't, that's not happening abroad. And then we've got this complete kind of contradiction around how we're approaching these things. So, I don't know which way it's going to go, but you don't want to race to the bottom, but there needs to be something structural that addresses it. And I don't think we're anywhere near getting there. And obviously the US is quite an outlier. We don't know what it's going to do from week to week, right? So,
I'm just going to add something to that on the US, which I think is particularly interesting, which is the dissonance, the disconnect between federal and state, because it's the federal government that's introducing so much of this regulation. And yet it's a lot of the red states, it's a lot of the Republican states who are making the most money from renewables and from clean tech. So how that plays out, there are so many different pressures all coming into play at the same time. And I think the word you used earlier was the perfect one. We are in a state of chaos. But I think it's almost necessary, and it was always going to happen, because fundamentally the global economy is in a state of transformation. The way in which we do business has to fundamentally transform, unless we want complete chaos. I mean, we are talking about managed change or disruption. Sorry.
No, you don't. I think that's right. I think one of the challenges we've got with things like onshoring, which is why the UK approach is driving decarbonisation, deindustrialisation, and fake decarbonisation, is because of the way it implements its carbon budgets. So, for example, it gives itself a carbon budget, and then it's got to hit that. But the easiest way to hit a carbon budget, because when you only measure the emissions around the British Isles, is to just farm it out and take it off your balance sheet and go, we've decarbonised, that'd be great. And it's this kind of back to this kind of methodological approach and failing that we see in net zero, for example, where we have a very flawed way of accounting and analysing the problem, which leads to really stupid activities and really stupid actions. And if you were to onshore production with the intention of making it cleaner and everything like that, your carbon emissions would actually go up, and you break all of the carbon budget rules that the UK set for itself if it was to onshore. So it's going to have to break its own rules, which it should do, or it's going to have to just keep getting other people to make its stuff and pretend that it's a climate leader.
So what you're basically saying is we need to completely rethink the way we set out the rules for the net zero transition. We need to completely restructure carbon accounting. We need to completely change the way the industrial base works. And where do we need to do this by?
Yeah, that could be quite good. Let's hope JD Vance doesn't meet him and give him the kiss of death.
Well, we already know what Complexities says about JD Vance in the spirit of Bishop Brunner. He said the same thing just recently. He criticised JD Vance for not being in the spirit of Jesus.
There we go. Well, that's it up there. I didn't know that had happened. So there we go. Yeah.
You talk a lot about risks, and I think in the climate space, rather than all that being doom and gloom and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Do you think there's space in the current kind of environment to talk more about the opportunity? Obviously, businesses, they want to mitigate against risks and climate change, especially if there's supply chains that are abroad or in countries where they might be affected heavily. But what about, there's a lot of potential benefits.
Can I say something about that? Because this is one of the things that bugs me the most. We have all of this work going on ESG and sustainability reporting. The data may not be great, but there is data that is being collected, and it is being reported, and then it is being left in silos and not dealt with. if you actually use the data and understanding what your business is, what it's doing, what it's spending, where it's spending it, what its model is, and you use that data to take advantage of opportunities, to identify new markets, new ways of doing things, that's a fundamental step that very few people seem to be taking. So we have this separation of risks and responsibility. Separation of risk and opportunity. But risk is a useful tool because most big businesses have a risk function. It's something they know how to do. And you can correlate climate exacerbation. You can correlate climate risk with things they're already worried about. So it's a nice, easy way of communicating it. But most sustainability, as far as I'm concerned, is about talking about what we're going to do in this way rather than changing the business and exploiting opportunities. And there is no doubt that opportunities exist. It's just a question of using your data in a different way. Now, you may disagree, but that's one of my pet peeves.
I think that's fair. I think, it's just probably fair to point out that, so much about sustainability, environmentalism is impact. And, I think also the tools that have been applied around kind of scares, the kind of scary projections and that kind of stuff. Obviously, you know why it's applied, but it's not very inspiring, to say the least. But I think one of the key things you need to, which maybe kind of links back to what we're talking about, this kind of maniacal focus on carbon. We need to look at we need to go beyond just looking at carbon, and resilience is a massively under addressed resilience and kind of, I suppose mitigation and resilience. There's a lot of focus because the hope has been, I suppose, the optimism has been, for as long as it lasted, we're going to reduce carbon emissions, we're going to get down to this net zero and then, job done. But reality, we're not. So, 1.5 went probably 10 years ago. So what's the resilience action? I think when we're talking about resilience activities and things we can do around carbon, I think it's always got to be coupled with resilience functions. So things around flooding, you say like tree cover in cities to address urban heat island, all these kind of things. There's lots and lots of really, really good stuff we can do that make everyone's lives better, make us all happier, and just make a quality of life better in some way, shape, or form, which do have some level of carbon benefit. But we've got to move away from just looking at carbon as the primary metric for everything, and we've got to focus a lot more on resilience. And I think resilience and risk go very beautifully together, and there's a lot of good things that we can do around resilience, and a lot of good things that we can do to kind of improve people's quality of life. Hopefully that's a more positive approach to some of this stuff rather than just carbon accounting the hell out of everything.
And I think it's also worth pointing out that the financial community is waking up to this, because one of the biggest conversations that's happening today is about the opportunities in adaptation, because mitigation was always the thing that people paid attention to. But adaptation, I think GRC's come out with a huge report, JP Morgan came out with a huge report. There is significant opportunity in doing things differently. So I think that's really worth it.
I think it's a really exciting space, and I think there's so many. By doing that, it's not like you're just trying to let's ameliorate the risk that we're on and go back to where we are 10 years ago, something like that. You could actually actively add positive well-being and lots of actually much. Yeah, exactly. It's constructive. So it's risk management, risk amelioration, but then actually building better things. So I think that's as someone, we do a lot of work in the urban environment and come from a kind of construction, infrastructure, engineering background. So the idea of designing and building things to make things better is incredibly exciting for us, I think.
Anybody else?
When I was in my final year of uni, I wanted to set up a sports equipment brand making tennis and squash rackets that are made out of graphene. Really excited about it was quite a new, sexy technology at the time, back in 2013. Unfortunately, head beat me to it, the racket brand, so I ended up not going for it. But let's say I had done it, and I had this brand making this type of equipment, but I really cared about my sustainability. But then I sat here and listened to the critiques of the problems with the SBTi's definition of net zero, the original definition of carbon neutral. But I really wanted to sell the sustainability angle of my sports equipment manufacturers are trying to push that. There's a lot of outdoorsy sports people actually do care about the environment. You've seen that with some ski brands. Rossignol brought out the world's most sustainable ski a couple of years ago. It's quite interesting. I'll show you what it looks like. What would you recommend to an entrepreneur or a business owner or people in that industry or any equipment manufacturer like that, when they're looking for, you mentioned a North Star earlier, they would probably feel quite lost. What would you recommend to them to adhere to? Or do they need to wait it out in the store for things to actually align and have a better definition?
I suppose on the assumption that the product is a fantastic product and is inherently better and everything like that. So they've got their vision and they've got everything they need to propel them from a kind of strategic and business perspective. I think if you're getting down to how you can showcase the sustainability and environmental and carbon credentials, you're going to have to do some carbon accountancy, and it's inevitable. But you want to be looking at what we call Scope 4, which is your avoided emissions. So you've got your impacts, which is Scope 1, 2, 3. Scope 4 is what are you doing outside of your supply chain? So let's say your tennis racket starts replacing 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 other purchases that are being made, say in the tennis racket industry, and everyone's switching to yours. Your emissions are going up, but you're actually taking carbon out of that sector as a whole because you've got a better product, it's more innovative, and you're taking market share. So you looking at Scope 4, avoiding emission, that's sometimes you've got your carbon footprint, and sometimes Scope 4 is called the carbon handprint, which is someone in marketing's been involved there. But it's good. And I think that's where we need to get to, because again, we're talking about impact and it's all very negative and that kind of thing. It's like, well, what if we go down this route, if we bring out this better product, if we take market share and we increase our emissions, that's terrible. But no, you should be increasing emissions if you've got a better product because you're displacing others. So we need to recognize that. We put that on the other side of the balance sheet. You're taking market share from the crappy incumbent. That's high carbon, very, very old tech, whatever it might be. You get to credit yourself with that as a not numerically and economically, but you credit yourself with that as a win. And you measure. We're big advocates of rather than say net zero and absolute reductions, which is based on carbon budget reductions, absolute terms every year, carbon efficiency. So year 1 you might make 1,000 rackets, year 2, 5, 6, 7. You go up and up and up. But the way we see it, again, if you're displacing an incumbent inferior product and you are increasing your emissions, but per racket spent, per racket made, the amount of carbon is decreasing because you're selling more and you're managing to keep your carbon footprint at a modest amount. The efficiency of the carbon being used, you're getting more for less, more rackets for a less amount of carbon. That's a good way to measure. We're big advocates for growing companies because they can't sign up to net zero because it's all about carbon budgets. So you've got to go big on carbon efficiency. We're going to displace. We're going to lower the average carbon intensity of a racket, and this is how we're going to do it. And I think that's a very innovative approach, and it chimes with the kind of the entrepreneurial and the kind of the growth mindset. And it's definitely a much better way to look at it from a carbon perspective as well.
So, were there any other questions? If not, I will. Chris.
You've talked a lot about how businesses over time pull back from their emission reduction targets, either stealthily or actively. And you said that we're not meeting our requirements for R&D over time. We're like, 10% where we need to be. Couple that with constantly changing definitions of what things like carbon neutral mean. How much of a knowledge and expertise gap do you think there is within companies? I'm not talking about consultancies who advance on that.
Yeah, I think it's quite substantial. We used to have the issue, I suppose, which I don't actually know the latest data on it, but we used to have, for example, I think it was 25 or even 50%, depending where you looked at the highest STEM graduates would go into banking because they can make more money tinkering with algorithms and things like that, which is an enormous waste of human capital. But I think a lot of the companies that we interact with, for example, they have a manager who's managing the flow of reporting, sustainability, that kind of stuff. But it's very unlikely that they'll probably have, unless they're a very innovative, growth-minded company, they won't have a technical team that are the repository of I suppose, the knowledge and the IP and the development and product development. And we don't get to speak to them. They're not considered to be part of the equation. They might be designing the next launch for the next product, but they're not part of the sustainability, and that's quite a big problem. So there's probably not enough of them. There's always a dearth of talent, shortage of talent inevitably, I think. But I think even structurally, maybe those companies that do have talent, which I'm sure there's a lot of talent in a lot of big companies, and a lot of, they're not being put in the right place. Like, as I said, they're not put into sustainability working group. They're not necessarily part of it, and it's not brought into them as part of their innovation and development cycle. So there's a fragmentation there, which is quite dysfunctional probably as well.
Thanks for that, Chris. I think that actually highlights one of the biggest challenges we've got. And I'm going to draw the conversation to a close now. So I'm going to say thank you so much.
Pleasure.
For joining us today. There's one last thing I wanted to say, though, which comes from that comment about, is it time to wait out the storm? No, the storm is not going anywhere. You need to learn about what's going on. If you want to start a business and you want to sell on sustainability, you've got to become literate about sustainability. We all need to learn to work in different ways. And actually, that's a huge part of what we do at Shaken Not Burned. So thank you very much for helping us spread the word. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back soon.